Hi class, it's Mr. Perks here. So I'm just going to go through with you today all the different historiographies that have to do with the American Revolution. Sorry about the lighting. Unfortunately, this is the best I can do right now. But anyway, when we talk about historiographies, what that is the study of history. So we're looking at why people analyze and interpret history the way that they do. So if we're going to start doing this, the very first one that we'll look at is the revolutionary interpretation. So these were pieces of history that were written by the people who lived through it in the American Revolution. So in the very late 1700s, early 1800s, these were written. So the two major contemporary historians of the Revolution were David Ramsay of South Carolina and Mercy Otis Warren of Massachusetts. So this was very right-wing and took the side of the Americans entirely throughout. Then we've got the loyalist interpretation. Now the loyalist interpretation, just like the revolutionary interpretation, was written by people who lived through it. Now these were written mainly by British historians and is much more left-wing and siding with the British over everything. And we'll see this a lot as we go through historiographies, as typically they're either going to be left-wing or right-wing. Some famous historians, one famous historian, sorry, that took on this loyalist interpretation and had books published by him was Thomas Hutchinson, who was the former royal governor of Massachusetts. Then as we move on, we get on to the Whig interpretation. So the main historian of the Whig interpretation is that of Edmund Morgan, and this was an interpretation that was written by someone who wasn't actually involved in the American Revolution. So this is a few years later. However, they still sided with the revolutionists when discussing it, that it was a push for liberty, and these kind of people, as well as the revolutionist historians, as we saw earlier, they see the American Revolution as a crusader for liberty. Then we have the imperial interpretation. So this came about a lot later in the 20th century, in the very early 20th century, and it saw a much more British perspective. It looked at America as a British colony that wasn't acting like a British colony should, according to them, and not as a bunch of revolutionaries who were rising up against tyranny. Then we've got the progressive interpretation. So this actually viewed the revolution through the lens of class and economic interests at the time. So when these progressive interpretations analyzed, such as that of Carl Becker. So Carl Becker, that's a really important historian to look up if you agree with this interpretation, was that the revolutionists, so those big founding fathers we've got like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and Sam Adams, they were pushing their own interests forward. So it wasn't the people that were rising up, it was these landowners, these wealthy people. And it really looks at it as almost looking at the founding fathers as kind of, I wouldn't really say evil, but seeing them not as the perfect way they're represented in a lot of American culture. Then we have the consensus interpretation. So this came around in the 1940s and 1950s. And famous philosopher John Locke, spelled with an E at the end, he was really into this interpretation, and the idea of it is that there is consensus in the past, that so it's looking for those kind of consensus where we had the people like us who don't hold any power, hold any real power, having the same desires as those who do raise the power. So we've got the people at the bottom here as the workers, the farmers, those working in the industry. Then we've got the landowners, we've got John Adams, Sam Adams, George Washington, all that. We're seeing that despite their differences, they have a similar goal. Now we move on to the neo-Whig / ideological interpretation. So one of the main people who interpreted this was Bernard Bailyn, and he argued that colonist ideology had its origins in the so-called radical Whig Republican tradition in England. This belief meant that the people of America, these colonists, were instilled with a strong fear, like a huge fear of tyranny and conspiracy, and a worry that their liberty could be taken away. So this interpretation, coming around in the very late 1900s, was around the time of the 60s, very much agreed with those who had the revolutionary perspective, who wrote about it during the Revolutionary War and the entire American Revolution. So, sorry, it's very similar to this interpretation, but obviously written at different times. Then finally, we have the neo-left or neo-progressive interpretation. Now, this was inspired during the 1970s by a lot of these civil rights and feminist movements in America. So it actually tried to see the American Revolution, and these historians like to see all aspects of history through the lens of people who are rising up and are fed up with something and will get radical about it. So it focuses a lot more on what the people were doing during the American Revolution. And a lot of, just like they were people who were around during the feminist and civil rights revolutions in America. Some really famous historians to check out for that is Gary Nash, Ed Countryman, and Woody Holton. Now these are all the ones that we'll go through, and if you got any questions, you know where to contact me, and I hope you're all going really well with all your work. Thanks.